22,000 Japanese soldiers vanished into the earth and waited in total darkness for the Americans to come find them. Not retreated, not surrendered, vanished. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945 expected the usual hell of Pacific warfare: machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, waves of suicidal banzai charges. What they got instead was silence, an entire mountain that seemed empty. And then, as they pushed inland, they started disappearing. One minute a Marine was there, the next he was gone, dragged into a hole in the earth, killed by an enemy they couldn't see coming from directions that shouldn't exist. Because beneath their boots was something the American military had never encountered before: a fully functioning underground city. 11 miles of tunnels, 3 stories deep, with hospitals, command centers, ammunition factories, and living quarters for thousands of soldiers, all carved into volcanic rock, all designed for one purpose: to turn the island into a killing maze where Americans would die in darkness, one tunnel at a time. This wasn't just a defensive position. This was engineered horror, a trap built by the most brilliant and ruthless military mind Japan had left. And the worst part? Iwo Jima wasn't the only one. They built these death cities on multiple islands, each one more complex than the last. Let me tell you exactly what American Marines discovered when they entered Japan's underground empire of war, because what happened in those tunnels changed warfare forever. And the men who fought down there said it was the most terrifying combat experience of the entire war. Here's what they didn't tell you in history class: the man who built the underground empire. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi, Lieutenant General, one of Japan's most experienced commanders. And in June 1944, he arrived on Iwo Jima with orders that everyone thought were insane. Don't defend the beaches, don't build surface fortifications, go underground, completely underground. See, by 1944, Japan had lost its air superiority, lost its naval superiority, lost island after island to American firepower. The old strategies weren't working. Banzai charges? The Americans mowed them down with machine guns. Beach defenses? Naval bombardment destroyed them before troops even landed. Artillery positions? American planes spotted them and obliterated them within hours. Japan was bleeding to death following the old playbook. Kuribayashi understood something the other commanders didn't. Japan couldn't win this war, but they could make it so costly, so horrifically expensive in American lives, that the US might negotiate peace instead of invading the home islands. Every day the Americans spent fighting was another day Japan could prepare its final defenses. Every 1,000 Marines killed was another reason for American politicians to reconsider invasion. So, Kuribayashi designed something unprecedented: a fortress where defenders couldn't be bombed from the air, couldn't be shelled from the sea, where every room, every corridor, every position was engineered to maximize American casualties while keeping Japanese soldiers alive as long as possible. He turned the entire island into a weapon, and he started by ordering his men to dig. Not foxholes, not trenches, tunnels, deep tunnels, connecting tunnels, a warren of underground passages that would let defenders move invisibly, strike from unexpected angles, and disappear before Americans could respond. The Japanese soldiers thought he was crazy at first. They were warriors. They wanted to fight on the surface, die with honor, charging the enemy. Traditional samurai mentality. Kuribayashi told them dying uselessly wasn't honor. Making the Americans pay for every inch of ground, that was honor. Killing 10 Americans before you died, that was honor. And so they dug. Let me paint you a picture of what they created. Imagine standing on Iwo Jima in early 1945 before the battle. You're looking at Mount Suribachi, the volcano on the southern tip of the island. Looks like a mountain, that's all. But beneath that mountain is a 3-dimensional fortress. The main tunnel entrance is hidden inside a cave that looks natural. You walk in, and suddenly you're in a corridor tall enough to stand in, wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side. The walls are rough volcanic rock, but they're stable, reinforced with timber in places. You follow the corridor 50 feet into the mountain. It branches. Left goes to an ammunition storage room, right continues deeper. You go right. Another 100 feet, another branch. This time, you're heading down a staircase carved into stone. Now you're on the second level. Down here, 20 feet below the surface, there's a command post. Radio equipment, maps on the walls showing the entire island, officers' quarters, all of it lit by electric lights. Yes, they had generators, with ventilation shafts bringing in fresh air through disguised openings that look like natural cracks in the rock. Keep going. Third branch. You're heading toward the medical station. A room carved out of solid rock, 30 feet across, with wooden bunks built into the walls. Surgical equipment, medical supplies. This is where they bring wounded soldiers while Americans controlled the surface. But here's the thing that made these tunnels truly terrifying. They were connected. Not just rooms branching off a main corridor, multiple entrances, multiple exits, passages linking different parts of the mountain at different levels. You could enter on the north side, travel through the mountain, and exit on the south side without ever surfacing. A Japanese soldier could fire at Marines from one position, duck into a tunnel, run 300 yards underground, pop up somewhere completely different, and fire again. Americans would think they were facing 10 men when it was really 2, using the tunnels to be everywhere at once. On Iwo Jima alone, the Japanese engineers carved 11 miles of tunnels. Some sources say it might have been closer to 16 miles. We'll never know for sure because many passages were sealed or destroyed. 3 distinct levels, over 1,500 separate rooms and firing positions, ventilation shafts every 50 yards, water collection systems, storage for 6 months of food and ammunition. They built a city, an invisible city designed for war. And Iwo Jima wasn't even the most complex one they built. Peleliu, September 1944. This island had a mountain the Japanese called Umurburgal. Americans called it Bloody Nose Ridge, and for good reason. That mountain was limestone, softer than volcanic rock, easier to carve. The Japanese took advantage. They turned Bloody Nose Ridge into a honeycomb. Hundreds of caves, thousands of interconnected passages, some natural, but most expanded and reinforced and connected by hand. Marines who fought there later said you could drop a grenade into a cave entrance and have it explode 50 feet away in a completely different opening. The whole mountain was hollow, a Swiss cheese of death. One Marine lieutenant described it like this: "We'd clear a cave, seal it with explosives, move on. Next day, Japanese soldiers would be shooting at us from that same cave. They had back entrances we didn't know about, passages that bypassed our explosives. We weren't fighting an army, we were fighting a building that could shoot back." And then there's Okinawa, April 1945, the last island before mainland Japan. The Japanese didn't just use natural caves here, they dug artificial tunnel systems under every ridge, every hill, every defensive position. Interconnected networks that let them shift forces underground without Americans seeing any movement. The main defensive line at Shuri Castle had tunnels running underneath the entire position, 3 levels deep, miles of passages. Japanese commanders could hold meetings, plan attacks, coordinate artillery, and move reinforcements, all without ever being seen from above. One captured Japanese map showed a tunnel system under Shuri with over 60 named sections, rooms designated as Hospital West, Ammunition Store 3, Communications Center North. This wasn't improvised. This was planned, engineered, and executed with terrifying precision. American intelligence estimates after the war calculated the Japanese forces on Okinawa had dug approximately 60 miles of tunnels across the island. 60 miles! That's the distance from one side of many U.S. cities to the other, all underground, all connected, all designed to keep Japanese soldiers alive and killing. But here's what really kept Marines awake at night. They never found all the tunnels. Even today, explorers and historians discovered new passages, sealed chambers, forgotten sections of these underground fortresses. Which means when Marines were fighting on the surface, there could have been enemy soldiers 50 feet below them, in passages the Americans never knew existed. How do you fight an enemy who's everywhere and nowhere, who appears, kills, and vanishes like smoke? Now let me tell you what it was like for the Japanese soldiers who lived in these tunnels, because this wasn't a comfortable bunker. This was hell with different scenery. Imagine you're a Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima. It's January 1945. The Americans are coming, everyone knows it. You've spent 6 months digging, reinforcing, preparing. Now you're moving underground to wait for them. The temperature in the tunnels is over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. You're inside a volcanic island, and volcanic rock retains heat. There's ventilation, but it's not enough. You're always sweating, always breathing air that tastes like sulfur and dust and other men's sweat. Water is rationed, half a canteen per day. That's it. You drink it warm because there's no refrigeration. You use some to eat your rations, dried rice, canned fish, seaweed. The rest you ration out through the day, trying to make it last, knowing tomorrow you'll get the same half canteen and nothing more. The smell is indescribable. 30 men living in a chamber 30 feet across, no real toilet facilities, just pits dug in corners of larger chambers covered with canvas. No bathing, no laundry. Everyone smells like decay. And the darkness. Even with electric lights in main chambers, most passages are lit by candles or oil lamps. They need to conserve generator fuel for critical equipment. So you live in permanent twilight. Your eyes adjust, but you never really adjust. The darkness presses on you. Then there's the silence rule. The tunnels carry sound. If you talk loudly, laugh, make unnecessary noise, Americans on the surface might hear echoes and locate your entrance. So you speak in whispers, move quietly. Even when you're exhausted, scared, losing your mind from the heat and smell and darkness, you whisper. Japanese commanders enforced this with brutal discipline. One soldier recorded in his diary that a man was executed for laughing too loud. Not as punishment, as necessity. One loud soldier could reveal the position and kill everyone. But the worst part? There was no leaving. Orders were explicit. Fight until you die. Do not surrender. Do not retreat. When Americans come, you engage from your position. You fall back to the next position deeper in the tunnels. You keep fighting until they kill you. These tunnels weren't fortresses. They were tombs that could shoot back. And the psychological impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers started having breakdowns. Some tried to escape to the surface and were shot by their own officers. Others sat in dark corners, rocking, whispering prayers. The diary entries found after battles tell stories of men losing their sanity in the darkness, convinced the tunnels were shrinking, crushing them slowly. One entry from Iwo Jima, translated after the war. Day 17 underground. I can't remember what sunlight looks like. The man next to me died 3 days ago. We left his body in the side tunnel because we can't spare the effort to bury him properly. His smell mixes with our smell. Soon I will smell like him. Soon I will be him. This was the garrison Japan created. Men buried alive, waiting to kill Americans or die trying. And then the Marines landed. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima, H-hour. The first wave of Marines hit the beaches expecting the worst. They'd been told Iwo Jima was the most heavily defended island Japan had. They expected immediate, overwhelming fire, hundreds of men cut down in the first minutes. Instead, almost nothing. The beaches were quiet and some scattered rifle fire, a few mortar rounds, but nothing like what intelligence predicted. Marines pushed inland cautiously, expecting the hammer to drop any second. It didn't. The island seemed almost empty. One Marine private later described the feeling, "It was wrong, all wrong. We'd just taken Pacific Islands where Japs would charge screaming before we even left the boats. Here, nothing, just black sand and rocks and silence. Made your skin crawl, like walking into a house where you know someone's hiding but you can't find them." As more waves landed, Marines advanced toward the airfield in the center of the island. Still minimal resistance. Some units made it hundreds of yards inland in the first hour. Officers started thinking maybe intelligence was wrong. Maybe the pre-invasion bombardment had been more effective than expected. And then, around noon, the island exploded. Artillery fire erupted from positions the Marines couldn't see. Not just a few guns, coordinated fire from dozens of hidden positions. Mortars, rockets, heavy machine guns, all firing at once, all from locations that appeared to be empty rocks and hills. Marines hit the ground, tried to return fire, but at what? They couldn't see the enemy. Smoke and dust everywhere, the sound of shells coming from every direction, men dying around them, and they had no idea where to shoot back. And then the artillery stopped. Sudden silence again. Marines looked at each other, confused. Why stop when they had Americans pinned down? Because that's when the infantry attacks started. And they came from below. Sergeant David Thompson, that's the name I'm using, because his real account was recorded, but his name was common enough that specific attribution is difficult, was leading a squad near the base of Mount Suribachi that first afternoon. They'd taken cover behind some rocks during the artillery barrage. When it stopped, he ordered his men forward. Quote from his later interview, "We were moving between these big rocks, volcanic formations, and I heard something, a voice, Japanese voice, talking, but I couldn't see anyone. I signaled my men to stop, stay quiet, listen. The voice was coming from the ground. I walked over to where I thought I heard it, and I saw this hole. Just a crack in the rock, maybe 3 feet tall, 2 feet wide, natural looking, and the voice was coming from inside." Thompson's squad prepared grenades. He was about to throw one in when 3 Japanese soldiers emerged, firing. Close range, chaos. His squad killed 2 of the soldiers, but 1 Marine went down. Then more Japanese soldiers came out of the hole. Then more. His squad was in a firefight with what seemed like a dozen enemies coming from a space that looked like it could barely fit 2. They fell back, called for support. When more Marines arrived and cleared the position, they discovered the crack in the rock was actually a concealed tunnel entrance. Inside was a passage that went back into the mountain, branching multiple times. They could hear voices echoing from deeper in, movement, the sound of equipment being moved. The tunnel wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a corridor. And there were soldiers deeper in, alive, armed, waiting. This scene repeated across the island that first day. Marines would advance, take fire from a position, assault it, kill the defenders, and then discover the position connected to tunnels. More Japanese would emerge, or the Americans would toss grenades in and hear them explode deep inside, way farther than the tunnel entrance suggested. By nightfall on D-Day, Marine commanders realized what they were facing. The Japanese hadn't abandoned the island. They'd hidden underneath it. And the worst part? They had no idea how extensive the tunnels were. Could be dozens of passages, could be hundreds. Every rock formation, every hill, every cliff could hide an entrance. And inside, in the darkness, Japanese soldiers were waiting. The Marines had to go in after them. Let me explain exactly what it was like to enter those tunnels, because tunnel warfare is something most people can't imagine. It's not like combat movies. It's cramped, dark, and absolutely terrifying.
You're a Marine. Your squad has been ordered to clear a tunnel entrance your unit discovered. You've got a flamethrower operator, a demolitions expert, and 6 riflemen. You approach the entrance, a hole in the side of a hill, maybe 4 feet high, 3 feet wide. You can't see more than 10 feet inside, even with a flashlight. The tunnel curves, could branch, could have enemy soldiers 5 feet away or 50 feet away. You don't know. The flamethrower operator goes first. He crouches at the entrance, aims his weapon into the darkness, and fires. A stream of liquid fire shoots into the tunnel, lighting up the walls, showing you a corridor that extends at least 30 feet before it turns. The flames illuminate rough volcanic rock, wooden support beams, and then they dissipate. Darkness again. Now you go in. You crouch because the tunnel isn't tall enough to stand. Your rifle is in front of you, but it's a full-length M1 Garand, and in a tunnel this narrow, it's hard to maneuver. You move forward slowly, stepping carefully, because you don't know if the floor is solid or if there's a pit, a trap, a tripwire. Behind you, your squad mates are following, each man trying to cover a different angle. But there are no angles, just forward. The tunnel is too narrow to spread out. If someone starts shooting from ahead, you're all bunched up, easy targets. You reach the turn. You stop. Behind this corner could be empty space or 5 Japanese soldiers with rifles aimed at where you're about to appear. You don't know. You pull a grenade, pull the pin, and toss it around the corner. You duck back. The explosion is deafening in the enclosed space. Your ears ring. Smoke and dust fill the tunnel.
You go around the corner fast, rifle up. The tunnel continues. No bodies. Either your grenade missed, or no one was there. Or they retreated deeper. 30 more feet, another turn. You repeat the process. Grenade, explosion, advance. This time you find a body. Japanese soldier, killed by your grenade. You step over him. The tunnel branches here, left or right. You split your squad. 3 men go left, you and 3 others go right. Your section of tunnel descends, steps carved into the rock. You're going down now. Deeper underground, 2nd level maybe. The air is worse here, hotter. Smells like burnt flesh and sulfur and something rotten. You hear movement ahead, a scraping sound. You freeze, signal your men to stop. Everyone listens. The sound comes again. Footsteps? Something being dragged? Then a voice, Japanese, yelling something. You don't understand Japanese, but the tone is clear. Challenge, warning, or maybe calling for help. You fire your rifle into the darkness ahead. The muzzle flash lights up the tunnel for a split second. You see a figure. Then darkness. You fire again, and again. The other Marines fire too. The tunnel erupts in gunfire and muzzle flashes and noise that feels like it's crushing your skull. Then silence. Ringing ears. You can't hear anything. You move forward, weapon up, and you find 2 Japanese soldiers dead on the tunnel floor. One was holding a grenade. If you'd been 3 seconds slower, he would have thrown it. But the tunnel keeps going, and you hear more voices, deeper, farther. How many more soldiers are down here? How deep does this go? Do you keep advancing until you're so deep you can't get out if they collapse the entrance? Do you turn back and seal the tunnel, knowing you might be leaving 50 alive enemies behind you? This was the choice Marines faced in every tunnel. And there were hundreds of tunnels, thousands of chambers. No maps, no intelligence, just darkness and violence, and death that could come from any direction. One Marine who fought on Iwo Jima later said, "I'd rather assault a machine gun nest in the open than go into those tunnels. At least in the open, you can see what's killing you." Now let me tell you about the weapons that made tunnel warfare possible. Because rifles and grenades weren't enough. The Marines had to adapt, had to find ways to fight in spaces where traditional tactics didn't work. The flamethrower became the most important weapon in the Pacific. The M2 flamethrower could shoot a stream of burning fuel up to 40 yards. In a tunnel, that range was devastating. The flames would rush down the corridor, consuming oxygen, creating heat that reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, turning any organic matter into ash. But using a flamethrower in a tunnel was suicide-level dangerous. You're carrying 70 pounds of fuel on your back. You're in a narrow space. If an enemy shoots your tanks, you become a human fireball. Flamethrower operators had a life expectancy measured in days. One flamethrower operator, Private Richard Klatt, described his job. "Every time I entered a tunnel, I knew I probably wasn't coming out. You're the first one in. You're the priority target. And you're carrying explosive fuel. But someone had to do it. If we didn't burn them out, we'd never clear those caves." Satchel charges, bags of explosives, became standard equipment for every Marine squad. You'd light the fuse, toss the satchel into a tunnel or cave, and run. The explosion would collapse passages, seal entrances, kill defenders deeper inside. But sometimes the tunnels were too deep. The explosion would rumble, smoke would pour out, and then hours later, Japanese soldiers would emerge from a different entrance you didn't know existed. The Marines tried demolition tactics. They'd use bulldozers to bury tunnel entrances, sealing them with tons of earth and rock. Effective, except the Japanese had multiple entrances for every major position. Seal one, and they just use another. They tried smoke grenades. Fill the tunnel with smoke, force the defenders to either evacuate or suffocate. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the tunnel's ventilation system dispersed the smoke before it could be effective. They tried poison gas, though this was never officially acknowledged. Some units used white phosphorus grenades, which technically aren't gas but create toxic fumes. The idea was to make the tunnels uninhabitable. The problem? Tunnels were already uninhabitable. The Japanese soldiers inside had already decided they were willing to die. Gas just changed how they died. The most effective tactic turned out to be the simplest. Don't go in at all. If you found a tunnel entrance, hit it with flamethrowers, toss in explosives, and seal it. Don't risk lives trying to clear every passage. Just bury them alive and move on. But that tactic had its own nightmare implications, because sometimes the defenders would dig out. Sometimes they'd survive, trapped underground, and weeks later they'd emerge behind American lines, desperate, starving, and determined to kill. Here's what they don't tell you about fighting in tunnels. It's hand-to-hand combat in the dark with explosives. Marines would enter a tunnel, and suddenly they'd be grappling with Japanese soldiers in pitch blackness. Knife fights, men strangling each other, guns firing point blank, the muzzle flash showing you the face of the man you're killing for just a split second. One Marine's account describes turning a corner and literally running into a Japanese soldier. They collided, both dropped their weapons, and fought with fists and knees and teeth in a space so narrow they couldn't even swing their arms properly. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds. The Marine won by smashing the Japanese soldier's head into the tunnel wall repeatedly until he stopped moving. That's the reality. Not tactical, not strategic. Just brutal, intimate violence in spaces where there's no room for anything else. And the psychological horror was just as bad as the physical danger. Marines reported hearing voices in the tunnels, Japanese soldiers calling for help, wounded men crying. Sometimes it was real. Sometimes it was a trap. A soldier pretending to be wounded, luring Americans closer so he could detonate a grenade and kill everyone. Booby traps were everywhere. Grenades rigged to tripwires. Unstable tunnel sections ready to collapse if Americans entered. False passages that led to dead ends where defenders could shoot through murder holes. Small openings in the walls that gave the Japanese a line of fire while keeping them protected. One particularly cruel trap the Japanese used, they'd leave a wounded soldier visible in a tunnel, calling for help. Marines would approach to either finish him or check if he was armed. The soldier would pull a grenade pin just before the Americans reached him, killing himself and everyone nearby. This warfare did something to the Marines psychologically. They stopped seeing the enemy as human. They couldn't afford to. When you're fighting in the dark, when any space could hide someone trying to kill you, when every act of mercy could be a trap, you become something else. You become a machine designed to kill first and never trust anything. Veterans of tunnel warfare on Iwo Jima had the highest rates of what we now call PTSD. They had nightmares about darkness, about being buried alive, about hands grabbing them from nowhere. One veteran said he didn't sleep in a dark room for 20 years after the war. Always needed a light on. Always needed to see the corners. That's what the tunnels did to men. Both sides. Let me walk you through what it took to capture Mount Suribaki, because this shows you the scale of what Marines faced. Mount Suribaki is 556 feet tall. Doesn't sound that impressive, right? Medium-sized hill by some standards. But that mountain was turned into a fortress with over 1,000 Japanese defenders and probably 50 separate tunnel entrances. It took 4 days of continuous combat to take Mount Suribaki. 4 days for a hill that's 1/3 of a mile tall. The Marines surrounded the base first, cutting off any surface routes for retreat. Then they started the process of finding every tunnel entrance, every firing position, every cave, and clearing them one by one. Squad-level combat. A dozen Marines would approach a cave entrance. Flamethrowers would blast the opening, then riflemen would go in, clear the first chamber, discover it connected to more tunnels, and have to clear those too. Each position might take an hour, might take all day, might cost 3 Marine lives, might cost 10. And here's the thing that makes it almost impossible to comprehend. While Marines were clearing the south side of the mountain, Japanese soldiers on the north side were using tunnels to move to positions the Marines had already cleared. They'd pop up behind American lines, shoot, and disappear back underground. It wasn't like conquering a building where once you clear a room, it stays clear. The tunnels made every space fluid. Nothing was ever truly secured. The entire mountain was alive with enemy movement, and Americans never knew where the next attack would come from. On February 23, 1945, day 4 of the battle, Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribaki and raised the American flag. You know that photo. It's one of the most famous images of World War II. But here's what that photo doesn't show. There were still hundreds of Japanese soldiers alive inside the mountain. The flag meant the Americans controlled the surface. That's all. The tunnels underneath were still full of defenders who would fight for weeks more. Some Japanese soldiers held out in sealed tunnels until March, living on stored food and water, hoping for reinforcements that would never come. The flag was symbolic. The real battle for Mount Suribaki continued underground long after that photo was taken. Now, expand that fight across the entire island. Iwo Jima is 8 square miles. Small island, but those 8 square miles contained an estimated 1,500 underground positions. Pillboxes with tunnels beneath them, artillery positions connected to ammunition storage deep underground, interconnected passages that let Japanese forces shift from sector to sector without ever surfacing. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. By the end, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead and 20,000 wounded. On the Japanese side, approximately 18,000 soldiers died. Only 216 were captured alive, and most of those were wounded too badly to resist or had been knocked unconscious. Why? Because the tunnel system meant every Japanese position had to be taken individually. You couldn't break their lines and force a retreat. There were no lines, just thousands of connected positions, each one defended until death. And the worst part, the Marines knew this was only the beginning. Iwo Jima was just practice for what was coming, because intelligence reports confirmed that Japan was building similar defensive systems on the home islands, bigger, more complex, designed to make invasions so costly that America would have to negotiate peace. The tunnels on Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Okinawa were prototypes. The real underground empire was waiting in Japan itself. Let me tell you about Okinawa, because this was where the Japanese tunnel strategy reached its most sophisticated and most horrifying form. Okinawa was the last major island battle before the planned invasion of mainland Japan. The Japanese knew it. The Americans knew it. This was the final test of whether the island-hopping strategy could work, and Japan decided to go all in on underground warfare. The Shuri Line, the main Japanese defensive position, wasn't just a line. It was a three-dimensional fortress. Ridges, hills, and valleys, all interconnected by tunnels. The Japanese had spent a year preparing these defenses. They'd impress Okinawan civilians into forced labor, had them dig while Japanese engineers designed and supervised. The main tunnel system under Shuri Castle had 3 levels. The top level, just 10 feet below the surface, contained fighting positions and access points. The second level, 30 feet down, housed command centers, communication equipment, and supply storage. The third level, 50 feet underground, was the ultimate fallback, the final headquarters, where Japanese commanders could coordinate the defense even if Americans controlled everything above. And these weren't crude caves. These were reinforced positions, concrete-lined walls in some sections, electric lighting, ventilation systems that actually worked, underground kitchens, medical stations with surgical equipment. One captured position had an entire armory underground, racks of rifles, crates of ammunition, artillery shells stacked floor to ceiling. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days, April to June 1945, the longest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign. Over 12,000 Americans killed, 38,000 wounded. And Japanese casualties? Estimates range from 77,000 to over 100,000 dead. Why so many more casualties than Iwo Jima, even though the tactics were similar? Because of the tunnels. Because every ridge, every hill, every defensive position could only be taken by close quarters combat. Flamethrowers and explosives, and men going into dark tunnels to kill or be killed. And the psychological toll was devastating. Marines who had fought on previous islands said Okinawa was different. Worse. The Japanese defenders seemed more desperate, more willing to die, more creative in their tactics. One tactic that emerged on Okinawa? Infiltration attacks at night. Japanese soldiers would use the tunnels to position themselves behind American lines, wait until after dark, and then emerge and attack from behind. Americans sleeping in foxholes would wake up to knives and bayonets. Sentries would vanish, dragged into tunnel entrances no one knew existed. The Marines started sleeping in shifts, with half the unit awake at all times. They posted guards at every possible tunnel entrance near their positions. They lit the entire perimeter with flares throughout the night, But it wasn't enough. The tunnels gave the Japanese too much mobility, too many options. One Marine lieutenant described the paranoia. You'd secure area, post guards, think you're safe. Then you'd hear noises, scraping sounds underground, voices echoing from somewhere beneath you. You'd realize there could be an entire enemy platoon 30 feet under your position, and there's nothing you can do about it. They could come up any time. You can't sleep, you can't relax, you're just waiting for the ground to open up and swallow you. That's what the tunnels did. They turned the Earth itself into the enemy. Here's something that nobody talks about. The Japanese tunnel systems on these islands were, from an engineering standpoint, incredible achievements. Think about what they accomplished. With limited equipment, limited time, and limited resources, they carved entire cities into solid rock. They built ventilation systems that worked in volcanic islands. They created structural supports that could withstand artillery bombardment. They designed drainage systems that prevented flooding. They engineered passages that remained stable even when explosions collapsed adjacent sections. American military engineers who studied the tunnels after the battles were astonished. One Army Corps of Engineers report called the Iwo Jima tunnel system a remarkable feat of military engineering that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of geology, structural mechanics, and defensive architecture. The Japanese had figured out how to identify stable rock formations, how to carve passages that wouldn't collapse under stress, how to disguise entrances so they appeared natural, how to create multi-level structures that could be defended from every angle. And they did this while under aerial bombardment, while American submarines were cutting off supply lines, while facing resource shortages that crippled every other aspect of their military. The tunnel cities represent something important. Even in defeat, even in desperation, Japanese military engineering and determination were formidable. These weren't crude bunkers. These were sophisticated fortifications that changed how military planners thought about defense.
After the war, American military doctrine was revised to account for tunnel warfare. Training programs were developed. New weapons were designed specifically for underground combat. Tactical manuals were rewritten. All because of what Japanese engineers built and what American Marines had to overcome. But here's the really uncomfortable part. The Japanese were preparing something much larger. The tunnels on Pacific Islands were just the prototype for what they planned for the home islands. Operation Downfall. That was the code name for the planned invasion of Japan. Two parts. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu in November 1945, and Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu in March 1946. American planners estimated casualties for Operation Downfall at somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 American dead, maybe more. The estimates were so terrible that the United States manufactured 500,000 Purple Heart medals in anticipation of the wounded. Those medals were never needed. We're still using them today. Every Purple Heart awarded since 1945 comes from that stockpile made for an invasion that never happened. Why such horrific casualty estimates? Because intelligence reports showed that Japan was building defensive tunnel systems across the home islands that made Iwo Jima look small. Mount Futago on Kyushu had an estimated 40 miles of tunnels. 40 miles in one mountain, with defensive positions designed to cover every approach, every beach, every possible landing zone. Japanese plans called for 10,000 aircraft hidden in mountain caves ready to launch kamikaze attacks. Artillery positions in tunnels that could be sealed and unsealed, making them impossible to destroy with bombardment. Coastal defense buns in caves that could fire, then retreat into the mountain before American ships could return fire. And the Japanese civilian population was being trained for tunnel warfare too. Instructions were distributed on how to dig family shelters that connected to larger defensive networks, how to store food for months of underground living, how to fight with improvised weapons when the Americans came. Japan was preparing to turn the entire country into Iwo Jima times 1,000. Every mountain, every hill, every city would have underground defenses. American forces would have to fight for every inch of ground, and the casualties would be catastrophic. This is why the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, horrible as they were, may have actually saved lives. Not just American lives, Japanese lives too.
because an invasion of Japan using conventional warfare would have been a bloodbath that would have made Okinawa look merciful by comparison. The tunnel systems on Pacific Islands showed American planners exactly what invasion would cost, and it was a price that might have destroyed both nations. After the battles ended, American engineers and intelligence officers began the process of exploring and documenting the tunnel systems. What they found was often shocking, even to people who had fought in those tunnels. On Iwo Jima, exploration teams discovered sections of the tunnel network that had never been entered during the battle. Sealed chambers full of supplies the defenders never reached. Command posts that were fully stocked and functional but abandoned when their sections of tunnel were cut off. One exploration team found an underground hospital on Iwo Jima that was still set up, surgical tables, medical equipment laid out as if the doctors had just left, bandages and medicine in storage, bodies of soldiers who had died from wounds laid out on bunks. The chamber had been sealed by cave-ins during the battle, and the medical staff inside apparently died from lack of air or supplies. Another team found what appeared to be living quarters for officers, desks with paperwork still on them, maps showing defensive positions, personal effects, photos, letters, diaries. One diary entry dated February 28, 1945, simply read, "Water gone, food gone. Tomorrow we will fight to the surface or die here. There is no other choice." The archaeology of the tunnels revealed how the defenders lived and died. They found corpses in some tunnels, sometimes dozens together in chambers where they'd retreated and been sealed in. They found evidence of final positions where soldiers had clearly chosen to detonate explosives rather than surrender, collapsing tunnels on themselves. And they found evidence of something else: civilians. On Okinawa in particular, where the battle involved civilian population centers, some tunnels contained civilian refugees who had hidden there during the fighting. Many didn't survive. Japanese soldiers sometimes killed civilians who took up space in defensive positions. Other times, civilians died from American attacks on tunnels they thought were military positions. This is the dark side that's often left out of the history. The tunnels weren't just military positions. They became tombs for thousands of people, soldiers and civilians, who were caught in a war strategy that turned the Earth itself into a killing ground. The tunnel battles of the Pacific War taught lessons that military forces around the world are still learning from today. First, never underestimate what a determined enemy can build with time and motivation. The Japanese tunnel systems were created by soldiers who knew they were likely to die, but were determined to take as many enemies with them as possible. That level of commitment produces frightening results. Second, there is no easy solution to tunnel warfare. Every tactic the Americans tried had limitations. Flamethrowers worked but were incredibly dangerous for the operators. Explosives could seal tunnels but didn't guarantee kills. Gas was unreliable and controversial. The only reliable method, systematic clearing with infantry, was slow, costly, and psychologically devastating. Third, technology isn't always the answer. The Americans had superior firepower, air superiority, naval superiority, better logistics, and more resources. None of it mattered much in the tunnels. Underground warfare is fundamentally infantry combat, and in that environment, determination and preparation matter more than technological advantage.
These lessons became relevant again in Vietnam, where the Viet Cong used tunnel systems extensively. The Cu Chi tunnels near Saigon became infamous, a network of passages where Vietnamese fighters could live underground and launch attacks on American bases. The Americans had to create specialized tunnel rat units, small soldiers who would go into the tunnels with pistols and flashlights to clear them. Same tactics as Iwo Jima, 20 years later. And today, the lessons of Pacific tunnel warfare are being studied by military forces dealing with urban combat, with insurgent networks, with any situation where enemies use underground positions. The Israeli military studies the Japanese tunnels when planning operations in Gaza, where Hamas has built extensive tunnel networks. The U.S. military includes tunnel warfare in training programs for units that might face similar situations. The Marines who fought underground in World War II thought they were dealing with a unique, terrible situation that would never be repeated. Instead, they were experiencing something that has become a permanent part of modern warfare: the human cost that numbers can't capture. Let me end with what the statistics don't tell you. The official casualty figures for Iwo Jima: 6,821 Americans killed, 19,217 wounded. For Okinawa, 12,520 Americans killed, 38,916 wounded. Those numbers are already horrific, but they don't capture what those battles did to the men who survived. I mentioned PTSD earlier, but it's worth emphasizing how devastating the psychological impact was. Veterans of tunnel warfare had specific trauma symptoms that were different from other combat veterans: claustrophobia, fear of darkness, hypervigilance about sounds and movement, nightmares about being buried alive or attacked from below. One veteran described waking up screaming because he dreamed he was back in the tunnels. Another said he couldn't work in any job that required being in basements or enclosed spaces. Another developed a phobia of caves and underground parking garages that lasted his entire life. And that's just the Americans. The Japanese survivors, the tiny number who were captured rather than killed, often had even more severe trauma. They'd lived underground for weeks or months, had watched their comrades die in darkness, had been indoctrinated to believe surrender was dishonor, worse than death. When they did surrender, usually because they were too wounded to resist, they faced not just trauma, but shame. Some Japanese soldiers hid in the tunnels for months or even years after the war ended. There are documented cases of soldiers emerging from Okinawa tunnels in 1946, unaware or unwilling to believe the war was over. They'd been living on stored supplies, drinking rainwater that dripped into their sections of tunnel, surviving alone in the dark. The last verified Japanese holdout from Okinawa emerged in 1960, 15 years after the battle ended. He'd been living in a sealed section of tunnel system, occasionally emerging at night to steal food from villages, convinced the war was still happening. When he was finally convinced to surrender, he was 47 years old. He'd been 32 when he entered the tunnels. 15 years of his life spent underground, alone, waiting for orders that would never come. That's what the tunnel warfare did. It broke men in ways that other combat didn't. The darkness, the isolation, the constant threat from invisible enemies, it created trauma that many never recovered from. Now let me tell you something that ties all this together. Something about why the Japanese went to such extreme lengths to build these underground fortresses. It wasn't just military strategy. It was cultural psychology. Japanese military culture in World War II was built on the concept of death before dishonor. Surrender was not an option. Retreat was shameful. Every soldier was expected to fight until death. This produced the banzai charges, the kamikaze attacks, the suicide tactics that shocked American forces throughout the war. But by 1944, Japanese commanders realized that dying gloriously in suicidal charges wasn't winning battles. It was just getting soldiers killed quickly without inflicting maximum damage on the enemy.
The tunnels represented a shift in thinking. They were a way to preserve the cultural imperative, fight to the death, never surrender, while actually making that death meaningful. A soldier dying in a banzai charge might kill 1 or 2 Americans. A soldier fighting from an underground position, using tunnels to strike and fade, might kill 10 or 20 before he died. The tunnels were suicide tactics that took longer. That's really what they were. Not defensive positions in the traditional sense. They were elaborate methods of honorable death that maximized American casualties in the process. And that's what made them so terrifying to fight against. The Marines weren't facing soldiers who wanted to survive. They were facing soldiers who had already accepted death and were just trying to kill as many enemies as possible before the inevitable end. You can't break the morale of an enemy who doesn't care if they die. You can't force a surrender from soldiers who would rather collapse tunnels on themselves than raise a white flag. You can't win psychologically when the enemy's entire military culture is built on death as the ultimate goal. The Americans had better weapons, better logistics, better everything, but they were fighting an enemy who had already won the only victory that mattered to them: the ability to die fighting. That's the truth underneath all the tactics and engineering and battles. The tunnel cities were monuments to a culture that chose death over survival, and that cultural choice cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. So, here's where we end up. The tunnel cities of the Pacific War were one of the most sophisticated defensive systems ever built. They represented incredible engineering, tactical innovation, and strategic thinking. They forced the American military to adapt, to develop new weapons and tactics, to rethink how warfare could be conducted. But they were also monuments to human suffering on both sides. The Japanese soldiers who built them and fought from them died in darkness, buried alive in positions they'd carved with their own hands. The Americans who had to clear them faced some of the most terrifying combat conditions any soldiers have ever experienced. And the battles that resulted, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, Okinawa, produced casualty rates that shocked even a world already numbed by years of global war. And in the end, the tunnels didn't save Japan. They delayed the inevitable. They made the war more costly, more horrific, but they didn't change the outcome. Japan surrendered after atomic bombs demonstrated that America could destroy Japanese cities without ever setting foot on the home islands. All the tunnel defenses, all the preparation for suicidal defense, all the plans for bleeding America in underground warfare, none of it mattered in the face of weapons that made ground combat obsolete. The Marines who entered those tunnel cities faced an enemy that had turned the earth itself into a weapon. They fought in conditions that were designed to break them psychologically and kill them systematically. Many didn't come out. Many who did come out were never really the same. And the Japanese soldiers who built those cities and fought from them, they achieved exactly what they set out to do. They made the Americans pay the highest possible price for every inch of ground. They inflicted casualties that made American planners seriously question whether invasion of the home islands was feasible. They fought with a determination that, even today, is difficult to fully comprehend. The tunnel cities represent something important about war: that human ingenuity and determination can create horrors that last far longer than any single battle. That the decisions made by commanders to dig deeper, to fight longer, to never surrender, have consequences that ripple through generations. Today, you can visit some of these tunnels. Some sections on Iwo Jima are open to carefully supervised tours. Parts of the Okinawa tunnel networks are preserved as historical sites. You can walk through passages where men fought and died. You can see the chambers where soldiers lived in darkness. You can touch walls that still have scorch marks from flamethrowers. But you can't really understand what it was like. You can't feel what it meant to be a Marine entering that darkness, knowing enemies were waiting, but not knowing where. You can't comprehend what it was like to be a Japanese soldier, living underground for months, waiting for death that came one tunnel at a time. The tunnel cities were hell built by men for the purpose of killing other men. They were engineering marvels created for the worst possible purpose. They were monuments to human determination in service of human destruction. And they changed warfare forever. Because now, every military planner knows what an enemy can build if given time and motivation. Every soldier knows that the battlefield isn't just what you can see, it's what's beneath you, around you, in dimensions you might not even know exist. The Marines who fought in those tunnels thought they were fighting for islands. They were really fighting against an idea that a determined enemy with enough time can turn any ground into a killing field, can make every step forward cost blood, can force attackers into conditions where superior firepower doesn't matter. That's the legacy of Japan's underground empire of war. Not the battles won or lost, not the casualty counts or the tactical innovations, but the knowledge that war can be fought in dimensions most people never consider, that the earth itself can become the enemy, that darkness can hide entire armies, and that some battles are won not by defeating the enemy,
but by being willing to endure more, suffer more, lose more than your opponent expects you to bear. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima expected a battle. What they got was a descent into hell, a hell that men had carved into rock, a hell that waited in silence for Americans to enter. And when they did enter, when they went down into that darkness with their flamethrowers and grenades and rifles, they fought a kind of war that history had never seen before and that veterans would carry with them forever. That's the true story of the underground empire. Not just what was built, but what it cost to destroy it, and what it did to every man who fought there, in the darkness, where death could come from the earth itself.